On this computer.
There we go.
Everyone behave. Okay, thank you, Shane.
All right, thank you very much, everyone, for allowing me to present on OpenChain. This is going to be a slide deck that's also easily available through the OpenChain website and community. And the idea is to give you some grounding here on what OpenChain is for and how it's doing it. I think there's a lot of commonalities and ways that we can interact on your SBOM work and so on. Let me get the context out there. I'm happy to take questions as I go or at the end, so feel free to jump in. Starting concept, OpenChain is about building trust in supply chains, in particular around the idea of open source compliance as a challenge. This is why companies came together and said, how do we create a trustable supply chain from the optic of open source license compliance? And that was the initial problem set that was being addressed. Now, when it comes to addressing this problem, we're looking at a very large ecosystem around open source. As you well know, Linux Foundation alone has gone well north of 1,000 members. We have a huge amount of the large companies in areas like the Fortune 100 and a large corpus, a growing corpus of projects, only one of which is Linux. So there's an awful lot of activity, an awful lot of companies providing feedback that helped define the problem set that OpenChain was designed to solve. The core concept is that inside Linux Foundation, and of course interacting with other projects and foundations, we're looking at having an open compliance program that provides an avenue for solutions. And if you were to make a stack of the various solutions out there, OpenChain is way up at the top. It's about having the key foundational processes in place for managing compliance. And once you have OpenChain as a general approach in place, then you can start to slot in things like your bill of materials, and then further down the stack, your tooling. So OpenChain is designed to set the tone. And essentially, the companies behind OpenChain, and up on this slide are the current governing board member companies, though our actual community consists of hundreds of companies involved in work groups and so on. These companies are extremely diverse, but the problem set was identical, and therefore the chosen solution, the approach to solution, was to find something that we could all use, regardless of size or market sector. So instead of making an enormous checklist or something like that to define and describe processes in detail, which would only be suitable for certain company sizes in certain sectors, or would become a library of material, perhaps a callback here to the old things like the Orange Book stats. You might recall those in the government software procurement cycle. Instead of having something incredibly detailed, we decided to define key requirements of a quality open source compliance program. And the idea here was to define inflection points and say that at these inflection points, you should have a process implemented. You should have training, you should have a policy. And if people put processes into these inflection points, as long as those processes themselves are of reasonable quality, we know that they'll catch the majority of issues that might arise. Once we do have those process points identified and people confirm they have something there, even if they have something minimal there, they're dramatically reducing the amount of errors we see. Indeed, when it comes to something like compliance, the main problem that people have is they lose oversight of the code or the version of the code or the provenance of the code. And if they have a process, almost regardless of what the process is, they're going to do a lot better than otherwise. So OpenChain defines the inflection points, but is itself not prescriptive about the process content. Instead of prescribing what a process should look like or what a policy should look like, we refer to a large reference library where people can go check what other companies in different sectors, different markets are doing. The idea here is that if companies adopt OpenChain, they put processes at these inflection points, then throughout the supply chain, as companies become OpenChain conformant, we have a dramatic increase in trustability of the software flowing through. We know, to put it in a very simplified manner, that everyone is getting insight at inbound, internal development, and outbound as they're dealing with their software. And immediately obvious here is that when it comes to filling out process points in an individual company, by way of example, on your inbound, you might use tooling, and that tooling might identify and store information in an SBOM like SPDX. So it all fits together. Like I said, we're the top of the stack, and then people decide how they're going to implement things. Ideally, automated as much as possible, but manual if that's what they need. It doesn't matter. We don't really mind in our spec, but our community as a whole is naturally heading in certain directions. Core idea is that if people have implemented processes at the inflection points, we know that they've got their policy, they've got their training, and that we can ask them specific questions to see what they did to fill out process points, to see what they actually implemented. So when people say that they're OpenChain conformant, if they use the badge in their procurement, their sales, their marketing, we very quickly know what type of questions we need to ask to kick the tires on how they've done things, and to answer questions like, to what degree is this automated? To what degree is it using a coherent, standardized SBOM versus something bespoke? This is all very simple and easy stuff in concept, and what's heartening is that an example of conformant organizations shows that the diversity of organizations becoming OpenChain conformant is as mixed, if not more mixed, than our actual board membership. So you have very small companies that have become OpenChain conformant as a whole doing software development. You've got very large companies in areas like automotive, which have got certain divisions OpenChain conformant to address market. The key point for us has been that we're seeing the adoption of this framework for inflection points. And once people do that, they start to have a good approach where they can easily then use SBOMs and tooling, and most especially work out how to interoperate throughout their supply chain. When it comes to the scale of the community, it's growing rapidly. We've got work groups who meet via mailing lists, calls, and physical meetings when the world is actually open. We have GitHub activity and so on. Our main mailing list is over 3,700 participants now. We've got over 100 active contributors on GitHub. We've got global automotive and reference tooling groups, each north of 100, 150 respectively. And then in areas like China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, India, and Germany, we've got work groups either active for a while, like Japan and China, or just spinning up, like Germany and Taiwan. All of these activities, in terms of the people involved, the rough number is that for every 3 people, we've got a company involved. That's what we tend to see when we dig into the stats. Now, when it comes to implementing a standard, as you well know, one way is to read the standard in detail and do that. And naturally, it's fantastic if people do take that measure. But when it comes to the practicalities of markets, and especially small companies with limited resources, we wanted to provide shortcuts so they could quickly get yes/no questions and see if they meet the core requirements of the spec. So we have an online self-certification questionnaire. It's yes or no. And people use that to determine if they might be missing a process inflection point. We actually get a surprising amount of companies coming in and using our online self-certification questionnaire in private just to do health checks. We found that in practice, about 50% of the users are companies moving towards conformance, 50% of the users are companies currently doing internal health checks and resource allocation mapping. To back up the ability of companies to actually implement a process implementation point, as I said, we don't dictate what the process contains. We don't say what the policy should be, but we do provide a large corpus of material to help people get to that. So we have material in multiple languages. We've got material displayed on our website ranging from case studies to reference training. And we have over 400 documents on GitHub to help give people grounding. One of our enjoyable challenges recently is trying to find quick maps through that so that when companies out of new sectors, let's say medical, come to the OpenChain project, we can quickly point them at appropriate reference material to speed up their ability to go through something like a self-certification questionnaire and work out where they need to allocate resources to improve process management. Backing up OpenChain beyond the user company scope is a partner program. So we've got various law firms, service providers, vendors, third-party certifiers that are involved in the OpenChain community and therefore are well aware of exactly what we're doing, how we're doing it, and why, so they can provide optional services if people want it. One thing that came up a lot is that beyond self-certification, what else is an option? And of course, at the other end from self-certification is global third-party certification. Right now, we've got that offered by PwC and TÜV. And I'm going to dig into a little bit more of that in a second, self-certification, third-party, and so on. But before I do that, I'll just set context that OpenChain has been in market since October 2016. We have iterated the spec a few times based on feedback. The latest version of the spec is from April 2019. That's version 2.0. And that version of the spec has been prepared and is submitted into ISO via the fast track process in JTC1. So you can check out our ISO formatted version of OpenChain if you so wish. We're doing this via the Joint Development Foundation, which is a project, a foundation to bring open source and standards together. That has a PAT submitter status. We're actually the first standard going through that right now. You'll be seeing some PR about that probably next week. We expect to be a formal standard around Q3 2020. This is important for us because we are seeing a lot of uptick in interest in OpenChain. Open source departments are increasingly collaborating with procurement and sales. But of course, it will be tremendously useful to have an ISO number for procurement departments to fit it into their normal procedure of working. What we have right now is an interesting situation when people are trying to deal with something like an approach to open source compliance. They tend to have their normal, let's say, ISO standards that they ask for functional safety, security, and so on. And then for open source, they have a stack of bespoke language and asks and contracts, which is not ideal. So having an international standard, an ISO standard that fits into their portfolio will be nice and neat and tidy. Okay, so I mentioned third-party certification, self-certification. I want to dig into that just briefly because I think it's important, and a point I'll come back to is that OpenChain is by user companies for user companies. So the key mission here is to make sure that companies using open source can effectively manage their compliance with as little friction as possible. So we want to make sure there's a freedom of choice here, that people can self-certify, they can get an independent compliance assessment, they can get third-party certification. I'm just going to dig very briefly into what that means. Self-certification is essentially where a company goes through something like our questionnaire, or they can read the spec and say, we meet the requirements. We can answer yes to every question. And at that point, they can announce that they are OpenChain self-certified. And their customer companies can say, that's great. As part of your certification, the standard requires you to have compliance artifacts. Can I see your artifacts to see if I like what your processes are? And that's where the kind of economics police sit. If people self-certify, they can say it to their customers. The customers can then say to the supplier, okay, let me kick the tires on how you actually implement it. What are your processes? Are you using an SBOM? Are you using tooling? And this is a way that OpenChain can flow through the supply chain, powered by economics when it comes to ensuring that people are meeting a reasonable standard, right? So your suppliers will provide you with material, you'll determine if you're happy with it, and if so, that'll meet the requirement of your market space. If not, you tell them to do better. That's an option that we think the vast majority are going to use, and in practice, in the hundreds of companies in our ecosystem, that's where most of the energy is. But it's not always that way. In areas like automotive, it's very common to have something like an independent assessment. So in things like functional safety, ISO 26262, people get independent security assessment to check out their functional safety. Exactly the same kind of conceptual approach. You can get an independent compliance assessment around OpenChain. That's where you self-certify yourself, but then you get a law firm or an auditor to kick the tires on your self-certification and ask the questions that your customers would otherwise potentially spend time doing. And of course, then there's the far out option, which is third-party certification. And that's where you see some large companies like Hitachi in Japan, their automotive section third-party certified by TÜV for the purpose of supplying Toyota. And they wanted to be the first third-party certified company supplying Toyota. Those three options depends on the market, depends on the amount of budget, the amount of time, and the amount of fidelity required. In areas like medical, you probably see a lot more third-party certification than self-certification, but not necessarily. I mean, in automotive, we've seen a few people go third-party cert. We've seen quite a few go independent compliance assessment, but a whole bunch of people are doing self-certification, and it's going fine in their sales and procurement cycle. Key point. This whole standard has been designed to identify the inflection points where we know things go wrong, right? So we're setting the framework based on experience. We've had open source to market for 25 years in enterprise and then other sectors. So we're taking this experience, we've distilled it down into a spec that's 12 pages with a lot of white space. And if people do something at these points, we know that the error rate is dramatically reduced. So we're not trying to make things perfect, we're trying to make the framework, and from there people can build and iterate and improve. Indeed, I'm based in Japan, so and Toyota is a board member, so things like Kaizen, continual improvement, are part of the dialogue around something like OpenChain. We set the framework, and from there you can improve and improve. The whole thing here is to ensure that we get something that's real-world suitable, that solves the problem of errors going to market. And we want to do that as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Self-certification does that most of the time. And where it doesn't do it, there's already the framework for independent compliance and third-party certification. Ending up here, OpenChain is entirely run by user companies for user companies. All of our board members are companies that are using and deploying open source. The idea here is that we're collaborating, create a single, shared, effective approach to managing the open source code. From there, we save a lot of time in every direction. And of course, it's not altruistic that, for instance, we have 18 companies as supporting companies in the board and hundreds of companies in the ecosystem. The companies that are not on the board are providing tremendous value in things like resources, reference material, and so on. And the board companies who are investing capital into areas like our marketing and outreach are getting a return by the fact that their supply chains are increasingly getting tidied up. And they can ask questions based on repeatable known areas that their suppliers will be doing something or should be doing something. OpenChain is well positioned, I think, to support supply chain management when it comes to areas like vulnerability as well. We have an active dialogue on how this can be accomplished. So OpenChain is becoming an ISO standard in the next few months. It'll be out there. And starting last Monday, we opened the dialogue under the auspices of the next generation spec. How do we capture all the feedback as we get ready for ISO, as we go out in ISO and we get a whole bunch of new companies, markets? How do we capture that feedback and ensure that we provide the appropriate reference material, guides, and maps, and in the future, iterations of the spec? And certainly when it comes to vulnerability management, a lot of people in our community are coming up to us and saying, while OpenChain is positioned to ensure that we have the inflection points for open source compliance hit, those inflection points map pretty exactly to a lot of things like security. Once you can identify your code, you know your version numbers, you have your SBOMs, you've covered a lot of the bases there too. So we're at this moment where we're looking at how do we make sure that we work with all the stakeholders. We make sure that our reference material and the energy from our community helps with these dialogues. So for OpenChain, in practice, we allow complete flexibility in SBOMs, whether people use them or not. But in practice, what we see is that people are looking for SBOMs. They're looking in particular at SPDX in the OpenChain community, and they're looking at ways to automate, ingest, and export around having that. And of course, if they do that, they're well positioned to address the issues regarding vulnerability management. Not necessarily all, but this is an open dialogue. And I'm here today because I think it will be fantastic if we could get some of your experience, knowledge, and feedback as we go to market with ISO and as we capture all of that energy from all of these companies around the world. Just by way of example, Kate mentioned SPDX 2.2 just came out. And there's a profile in it called SPDX Lite. And in essence, what happened is that companies in Japan, Fujitsu, Hitachi, Toshiba, have been using SPDX, and they've been using tooling fossology in market production for quite a while. And they hadn't really shared notes a great deal until they got together in the OpenChain work groups, and they said, well, you know, let's synchronize on our SPDX work. And what subset precisely of SPDX are we using? So they did that, and then they went to the global community, and that became the SPDX Lite profile. So that kind of dialogue, that kind of energy is what I believe we can do a lot with. You can help us with ntia-sbom, you can help us with some of the compliance dialogue, but you can especially help us with this vulnerability management discussion, which is brewing in every aspect of our global community. That's it in a nutshell. I would love if you could pop over and join our community, say hi. You can kick the tires on the self-certification questionnaire. That's a place, it's a sandbox. So basically you can go in there, create an account, mess around with the questions. And unless you decided to both submit and announce, no one would ever know what you're up to, which is great. That's why companies are using us to health check, right? Because they can go in there and they can do that. So I'm gonna stop there and take any questions or comments you might have.
Great, thanks. Yes, thank you. Just real quickly, we don't normally record, so I'm going to just proceed as cautiously as possible. I'm going to propose I'll just hit stop on the recording here, and we can have our discussion. But we've got your your presentation down if folks want to listen to it later. So I'm about to click stop unless anybody wants to argue about that choice.